This is Pearl. Those of you who watch the skits I release as YouTube shorts or my Arcane rewrite video will know her as my sister. The reason I'm bringing her up is because a while back, she decided to make me read The Fourth Wing, a book by Rebecca Yarros. This book was a smash hit on TikTok a while back, which should inform you about its literary quality from the get-go. Why she made me read it? Well, she was forced to read it by one of her associates, and decided that forcing me to share in her suffering was a good source for her entertainment. So, now I'm ranting about this book for your entertainment. Actually, that's a lie. I'm mostly making this video because I need to have some kind of feeble justification for wasting a week of my minuscule free time. I have very little that is positive to say about this book, so if you liked it, I recommend you get off this video now. And if you're concerned about spoilers, well, I can assure you that there is nothing in this book worth spoiling. So, here we go. So, what's Fourth Wing about? Well, I'll start by reading the synopsis of the book. 20-year-old Violet Sorrengail was supposed to enter the Scribe Quadrant, living a quiet life among books and history. Now, the commanding general, also known as her toughest Talon's mother, has ordered Violet to join the hundreds of candidates striving to become the elite of Navarre, Dragon Riders. But when you're smaller than everyone else and your body is brittle, death is only a heartbeat away, because dragons don't bond to fragile humans, they incinerate them. With fewer dragons willing to bond than cadets, most would kill Violet to better their own chances of success. The rest would kill her just for being her mother's daughter, like Seyden Ryerson, the most powerful and ruthless wing leader in the Riders Quadrant. She'll need every edge her wits can give her just to see the next sunrise. Yet, every day that passes, the war outside grows more deadly. The kingdom's protective wars are failing, and the death toll continues to rise. Even worse, Violet begins to suspect leadership is hiding a terrible secret. Friends, enemies, lovers, everyone at Basgiath War College has an agenda, because once you enter, there are only two ways out: graduate or die. Yeah, just from the synopsis, my first guess was that Violet was either gonna bang this Seyden fellow or bang the dragon. I think you can guess which one I would have preferred to happen. So, our story starts with protagonist Violet Sorrengail, youngest daughter of a family of dragon riders, which is considered a prestigious position in the same way that being a hell diver is considered a prestigious position. Violet doesn't want to be a dragon rider, but her mother does want her to be a dragon rider, so she's sent to the Dragon Rider Academy to become a dragon rider. First thing that you'll quickly realize is that the Dragon Rider Academy is kind of an idiotic institution. If a story has some kind of institution that's designed to churn out elite badass warriors, then often these institutions will be written to have such brutal training regimes that many of the people who enlist in them die. And Fourth Wing is another example of this. It's typically used as a way to heighten tension in a story and also kill off irrelevant characters for cheap emotional shock value, but it's kind of dumb both for Watsonian and Doylist reasons. From a Watsonian perspective, killing your recruits is idiotic. Militaries need to be efficient with how they use their manpower, so throwing future soldiers into a meat grinder is the kind of thing that would immediately get shut down. That's also ignoring how easily a Death Academy can accidentally kill off a potentially brilliant asset to the army. Maybe Jimmy has the potential to be a peerless tactician or a brilliant medic. Too bad you killed him in the training exercise. From a Doylist perspective, it does nothing to actually heighten the tension because the characters that die are almost always the background extras that the audience knows are slated for death anyways, since it's not like any author will kill a major character. And since the book is all about how Violet is the specialist special girl, it's pretty obvious that she's not going to die, so all this flair about death and brutality just seems redundant. So anyway, Violet gets to the Dragon Rider Academy, and the first thing they make all the new recruits do is walk up a balance beam to get into the academy. Okay, in the book it's called the parapet, which is a type of low wall used in defensive buildings, but in Fourth Wing it's basically a balance beam. Violet immediately meets Dylan and Rhiannon, whom she becomes friends with. So you know how in most stories about a milquetoast white person, they either have a black friend or a gay friend? Well, Rhiannon is the black gay friend, and her special ability is being twice as irrelevant as either the black friend or gay friend. Seriously, in most of her appearances, she's kind of a background character. As for Dylan, his whole shtick is that he's gonna get married to his girlfriend after graduating. Isn't that sweet and cute and... This is so sad. Alexa, play Entry of the Gladiators. Anyways, when the recruits get to the top, Violet meets her childhood friend Dane, whom she has a crush on. This is meant to create conflict, as Violet will be forced between choosing whether to devote her affection to the literary third wheel or this dark and brooding bad boy Seyden Ryerson, even though we all know she's gonna end up with Seyden because besides this being a booktok romance that's a slave to the formulaic trope fest, his name is literally stated in the synopsis of this book. Anyways, Dane's whole shtick is he's in love with Violet, but is also in love with a military regulation manual. He basically tries to get Violet out of the Dragon Rider Academy, and Violet is all like, "You don't have faith in me!" And while the novel expects you to take Violet's side in this argument, she spends a lot of the book worrying about how out of her element and how weak she is, which kind of undermines her entire position here. And this wishy-washiness from Violet will continue to be a recurring thing until she gets her dragons. Yes, dragons, plural. We'll get back to that. On the other hand, Xaden Ryerson is the son of the leader of the rebellion. After his parents were executed, he and the children of all the other rebels were put into the Dragon Rider Academy in the hopes that they will all die, and Xaden has it out for Violet because she's the daughter of the woman who killed his father. But despite their animosity, Violet can't help but feel attracted to Xaden. But back to the Dragon Rider thing. This book's brilliant idea to set the scene for the protagonist to meet her BookTok mandated love interest is to have the guy be forced into the Dragon Rider Academy, and all I can ask is, why? Why are you giving the children of the traitors, who may harbor the same sentiments as their parents and most definitely will after you keep perpetually treating them like shit, access to dangerous military assets? The doylist reason is that we need a contrived enemies-to-lovers plotline to hit all the emotional beats without a care for narrative or thematic cohesiveness. But that doesn't matter if the Watsonian reason doesn't hold up to scrutiny, and it doesn't. Anyway, Violet gets assigned under Xaden's command, because obviously, and then has to go through Dragon School. So, Dragon School is basically just a standard anime boot camp, meaning that it is entirely structured around making the protagonist look like the specialist special person to ever special. I'd go over most of these lessons, but the main things you need to know about them are Xaden and Violet flirt, some random background extra dies, and Violet monologues about how she's out of her element, not necessarily in that order. So the kids finally get the opportunity to get chosen by their dragons, and Violet gets chosen by the biggest, baddest dragon of the bunch, Tarn. This kind of power fantasy stuff is typical in most of these specialist special protag books, but Fourth Wing ups the ante by having Violet be chosen by another dragon, Andarna, who is considered one of the weaker dragons. I say considered as one of the weaker dragons because she will later be shown as having over-the-top powers, because of course. This is where I actually start being able to tolerate the book some more though, mainly because Tarn is at least a funny character to read. Unfortunately, that tolerance can only go so far, because the rest of the book is still just as much of a slog. As for the rest of the plot, Violet survives the shenanigans at the academy, falls further in love with Xaden, Xaden falls further in love with Violet, yada yada yada, and then Xaden reveals that he and the other rebellion kids have been delivering weapons to a neighboring country so they can fight the Venin, which are basically people who have been corrupted by dark magic. They fight a bunch of these Venin, and Violet gets taken away by Xaden to join the rebellion. So as far as plots go, Fourth Wing is a plot where a whole lot of whatever happens. The narrative is based around creating random scenarios for the characters to bounce around and interact, in the hopes that you, the reader, care enough about these characters to enjoy watching their interactions. Unfortunately, let's just say I've seen characters with more depth in gacha games, so that should be a testament to what you can expect. There's a whole plethora of them, but the only ones who really matter are Violet, the Subaru, Dane, the Rem, and Xaden, the Amelia. So let's start with Violet. Violet is fairly mediocre as a protagonist. She's generally described as a weak but smart character, but the way the story uses these traits is frankly insulting to both the weak and the smart. Her intelligence is less of a defined character trait and more so a narrative crutch to infodump crappy world building onto the reader rather than implement it in an organic manner in the story, which is frankly impressive considering this story is set in a school. Her dynamic with Xaden, which is supposed to be one of the main draws of the story, is so banal, essentially boiling down to her saying she needs to be careful around him but also desperately wanting to bone him, something her family says is a terrible idea. On the topic of her family, she barely has any interactions with them despite them being the reason she's even at this school in the first place, and nearly all of them revolve around Xaden, boiling down to them telling her to stay away from him and her going, "But he's so hot, oh no!" Seriously, are all of her thoughts just being horny for Xaden? It definitely feels like it. There's also the fact that the novels like to claim that Violet has a disability in the form of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, but it doesn't actually show it and instead seems intent on showing a rather toxic portrayal of physical disabilities, implying that people with disabilities should just push through the pain instead of have their disabilities accommodated. She's also just annoying to read because the prose just makes her sound incredibly juvenile to the point that I was dead-ass rooting for Jack Barlow and Amber Mavis, two antagonist characters, just by virtue of the fact that they shit on her. I know her thoughts are already pretty immature, but she's supposed to be 20 years old. I guess some adults do act like they never exited middle school though, so maybe that's unfortunately accurate. If my day job has taught me anything, it's that we might all be doomed. So Violet is a sad sack of superficial traits masquerading as a character, so what about the two love interests? Surely they'll be better? Well, don't get your hopes up. Dane is a whiny bitch whose sole virtue is that he's one of the few people who calls Violet out on her shit. However, since he's basically the blue-haired waifu in the love triangle, pretty much every scene that has him is him getting one-upped by Zayden to show how awesome the designated winner is in comparison. Unfortunately, the designated winner is one of the most uninteresting characters I've ever read, which is kind of accurate to most anime romances, I guess. In the case of Zayden Ryerson, Zayden was written as the ideal fantasy boyfriend for a girl, and I cannot stand reading about him. I know there are many guys who are fond of dangerous women, because I am one of them, but they usually have depth alongside their danger, which makes them compelling characters that are interesting to read. Zayden doesn't have that depth. When we first get his point of view, the only thing on his mind is Violet, 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 Violet. He's just a booktok mandated love interest, meaning he's dark and disturbed, but is secretly a softie inside, but only for the protagonist, and that's all there is to him. So what about the dragons? Dragons are cool. Surely a Dragon Rider Academy would be interesting enough to stick around for? Yeah, you'd think so. But since the plot is a human centipede of Violet's horny thoughts and action set pieces, the dragons end up kind of becoming an afterthought. The dragons as characters are mostly relegated to the role of the peanut gallery for most of the book, and the function of the Dragon Riders and dragons as a military unit is just poorly thought out. Riding the dragon and fighting are almost always divorced from one another, seeing as all the cadets use and train with melee weapons, and there is barely anything written about how to use the dragons in this world's military doctrine. Like, was the author not able to think of a way to use dragons as a military asset? I doubt that, because I can think of a few ways to use dragons as a military asset pretty easily. What if we had dragons carry heavy ordnances and drop them on enemies? Or trained elite soldiers with the dragons to drop into enemy lines like paratroopers? Maybe use dragons to do logistic runs for theaters that would be difficult to supply through conventional means. I get that the author doesn't have to write every piece of a fantasy military doctrine, but the lack of care put into the matter clearly shows where her priority with this story lies. There aren't any unique or compelling themes to chew on this story. You're not supposed to be interested in the war or politics of this world. That's all mostly window dressing for the real story, which is Zayden and Violet's relationship. Unfortunately, like I said before, the relationship is just bad. Zayden falls in love with her like if a programmer went into his head and changed a Boolean variable, while Violet's thought process when it comes to Zayden just revolves around how hot or amazing he is, neither of which make a compelling relationship. Of course, everyone on TikTok seems to think this shit is amazing, which gives me the impression that people on TikTok don't understand that romance isn't just two characters staring at each other with uwu faces and eventually kissing. If we want an interesting romance, we need two distinct characters with their own individual traits, we need to know what they think about each other, and no, they're in love doesn't qualify. Romantic partners think more about each other than just that. And ideally, with positive relationships, we need reasons for them to like each other, and no, being hot isn't a good reason. Hot people are a dime a dozen, yet even the most degenerate weeb still picks a favorite waifu. The major moments that make for a strong romance are when two romantic characters open up to each other, reveal things about themselves that they wouldn't to other people, show off their vulnerabilities, you know, the kind of things you wouldn't reveal to your friends. The touching of the deeper personas, for lack of a better term, which would be difficult because neither of these characters have any deeper personas. Their relationship is mostly just moments where they feel attracted to one another and flirt, and also two sex scenes. Granted, that's probably to be expected from any book that markets itself as enemies to lovers. Most are either just Romeo and Juliet with a dash of tsundere, or carrying so many red flags you could probably write, "Get the fuck out of there!" in Semaphore. I think that if the author actually wanted a relationship where enemies become lovers, they should have paired Violet up with Imogen. You know, the girl Zayden makes train Violet. Unlike Zayden, who mostly is just a suave bad boy, Imogen is actually enemies with Violet from the start, and actually has to go through the process of building a better relationship with her. Of course, it would never happen because all these white girl authors are slaves to the ubiquity of heteronormative conventions. Ultimately, this story is the equivalent of junk food. It offers very little in anything that can be considered thematically substantial, just emotions to feel a quick high. If that's what you like, then there's nothing wrong with that, but I personally prefer my stories to have a little more substance to them. So, yeah, I didn't like Fourth Wave. And don't ask me to read the sequel, because I nearly threw it across the bookstore after reading the first line. So, thanks for watching. If you suffer from reading this book like me, you have my deepest sympathies and condolences. But if you enjoy listening to me complain about it, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for future videos. And I'll see you next time.